Grüß, willkommen in einem aufregendes video, or perhaps I should say, Здравствуйте. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case episode 23 of my organisational series of videos. In this video I'll cover Russian infantry divisions and how they were structured during the war and how it changed during the war. I created these videos in order to assist my efforts in creating army lists for a number of different micro-armor sets of rules. I found it surprisingly difficult in getting accurate information on the subject. Either I could obtain an accurate snapshot of a formation, but could not obtain info on the changes which occurred, or there was a serious mismatch between formal organisations and actual organisations. Before I proceed with the video, just a quick caveat. My analysis of TO&Es has been focused on creating army lists for micro-armor sets of rules. As a result, it may not meet the robust standards of a historical analysis. So if your expectation is an in-depth, never disclosed analysis of the structure of a division, then this may not be what you need. It's possibly a little bit higher level than that. Another area I just wish to quickly cover is the sources. In some cases I've obtained high quality official structures, in other cases unreliable TO&Es. The bulk of my information comes from the excellent Niehorster documents. In my case I use the source from Carl and the www.niehorster.org site. My other sources are too numerous to list, but they range from wargaming TO&E books from the 1970s to Wiki. Final point to cover is I generally do not include transport supply signals and other administrative formations. My main focus is combat troops, although in an emergency non-combat troops often found themselves in combat. I have to admit there's no way I'll be able to provide a truly accurate description of all the changes which occurred with the Russian Infantry Division, as there were a lot. The Russian issued official organisations on a regular basis. We will start with what I call TO&E 4/20-38 Infantry Division. I'm uncertain what the numbers mean, but 38 is the year when the structure was officially documented, specifically April 1938 in this case, so that number is probably the year. This division was a whopper. It was large, lavishly equipped and complex. It also failed miserably in Finland, although worked rather well against the Japanese. The standard reason given for why this division failed was the Russians lacked the ability to have a large Western divisional structure. I personally feel the real reason was Stalin's purges, as what made this division fail in Finland but succeed in Mongolia was experienced officers. I am uncertain how many divisions were equipped to this level. I have no doubt many lacked all the equipment, but on the other hand the Russians did possess sufficient equipment. So it's possible most of the frontline divisions were equipped to this level, but on the other hand, it's also quite possible maintenance issues would reduce the total numbers of some complex equipment. Let's first drill down into the infantry regiment. The infantry regiment had a large support formation with companies of anti-tank guns, infantry guns, heavy mortars and quad Maxim MGs. This is a rather large support formation and would allow the regiment an astounding level of independence. The infantry battalion was also well equipped, especially with anti-tank guns, which in the early war period was rare. A lot of new equipment was issued in 1937 and 1938, so I expect this structure was designed around these new weapons, or perhaps vice versa. After the infantry regiments, the most important formation in the infantry division, or rifle division, was the artillery regiments. The Russian infantry divisions consisted of two artillery regiments, one equipped with 76mm guns and 122mm howitzers, and the other with 122mm howitzers and 152mm howitzers. I wonder if some of the 122mm howitzers were actually 122 guns. But regardless, the Germans noted how Russian counter-battery fire was unusually effective, and the Russian guns, especially the 122mm guns, outranged the German 15cm howitzers. The Russian artillery was generally quite good. The 76mm guns could and were used in an anti-tank role, although lacking the low profile of a proper anti-tank gun. This would have been mainly at long range using high explosive shells, as occurred with the French 75mm guns in 1940. The early German tanks were susceptible to even HE rounds. In terms of armour, the infantry divisions were well equipped, with 2 companies of light tanks and 1 company of light armoured cars. This division was capable of armoured attacks. On the other hand, in 1941, most of the equipment was in poor condition, so I expect the infantry divisions lacked the ability to maintain a lot of this armour adequately. This could have been the result of the purges, but putting that aside, the division could launch a decent armoured attack if everything was working. The only thing missing was adequate motorised infantry, but it did have a single company of motorcycle armed infantry and 2 horse-mounted companies. With adequate leadership and doctrine, this combination would have been formidable. However, the Russians lacked both. The other supporting formations of the infantry division were reasonably adequate and standard, except for the unusually good anti-aircraft capability. After the war with Finland, the Russian implemented a new infantry divisional structure. The anti-aircraft battalion was beefed up, the light tank battalion was removed, but the reconnaissance battalion was beefed up. The regiment was also modified, that's the infantry regiment, with the manpower reduced and a number of other adjustments, but nothing major. The real lesson of the Finnish war was not really learned. Once again, starting with the infantry regiment, the biggest change was the reduction in size of the infantry company in the infantry battalion, from 234 men to 178 men. A minor change in the infantry battalion was a small increase in the number of 82mm mortars. The regimental support formations experienced a number of reductions in manpower as well, with some companies reducing in manpower. The cavalry platoon was also removed. But apart from these reasonably minor changes, there was no fundamental change to address the issues uncovered in Finland, which was a lack of experienced officers. There was no real change in the 2 artillery regiments for this particular change. One consisted of light artillery, while the other was typically an artillery regiment which possessed a mix of light and medium howitzers, as was the previous structure in 1938. Basically, there was no changes in this new 1941 structure. The Russian armoured and reconnaissance was totally reorganised, with the light tank battalion being removed and the new reconnaissance company possessing some armour, both armoured cars and light tanks, to compensate. This was actually a sensible change. The anti-tank battalion, engineer battalion, chemical company were all unchanged. The only change here was the anti-aircraft battalion, which received an extra 37mm anti-aircraft gun battery. For obvious reasons, that is the German invasion, the Russians created a new structure for their infantry divisions in July 1941, which in effect were emergency divisions. The divisional structure had a dramatic reduction in heavy weapons at almost every level. It retained 3 infantry regiments, which each possessed 3 infantry battalions, but every other formation was dramatically reduced. The infantry were very poorly trained, and these divisions were quickly raised and in many cases quickly destroyed, but were necessary because of the emergency. At the infantry battalion level, the number of automatic weapons in the company was reduced, the anti-tank guns removed, and the 82mm mortar reduced from 6 mortars to 2. In terms of manpower, the infantry companies were similar in terms of numbers of men, but in terms of heavy weapons, there was a major reduction. In many ways, this worked well, as with a lack of experienced troops, reducing the number of complex weapons allowed the officers to use simple tactics which they could quickly implement. At the regimental support level, the reduction in heavy weapons was not as severe. The anti-tank guns and engineer companies remained much the same. The mortar company's strength was reduced from 4 weapons to 2, as was the infantry gun company from 6 weapons to 4 weapons. The anti-aircraft company was a surprise, with 6 37mm anti-aircraft guns being added. This may have been a result of the effectiveness of the German Air Force. The Russian Rifle Division lost its medium artillery regiment, but the light artillery regiment gained an extra artillery battalion. For all practical purposes, the infantry division lost an effective indirect fire capability, with the 76mm guns being used in a direct fire role in most cases. Once again, this is a reflection of the reality the Russians found themselves in. Direct fire guns were simpler to operate than indirect fire artillery. The infantry division now lost its reconnaissance battalion, with only a token reconnaissance company remaining. As these divisions were mainly used in defence, this was probably sensible. The Russian Infantry Division also lost its anti-tank battalion and chemical company. The Engineer Battalion lost its bridging column. The anti-aircraft battalion remained unchanged, once again a reflection of the effectiveness of the German Luftwaffe. Once the immediate crisis had stabilised of a sort by the late 1941 period, the Russians continued to modify their rifle division structure to increase their effectiveness. The Russians decided to focus on anti-tank rifle companies as their way to deal with German armour. And while seemingly illogical, it did cause the Germans great discomfort and was one reason why the Germans deployed armoured skirts on many of their armoured vehicles. The Russians also decided on focusing on mortars and creating a mortar battalion at the rifle regimental level, which pooled all their mortars except the 50mm mortars, and apart from a small section of 82mm mortars left in the rifle battalions. Unfortunately, the regiments lost almost all its other supporting formations, such as the anti-aircraft company, engineers, anti-tank guns, regimental guns, and heavy mortars. The 120mm mortars were now pooled into heavy mortar battalions, which was now added at divisional level. This provided a lot of the indirect fire capability which would otherwise be expected from the artillery regiment. Let's drill down into the infantry regiment. The Russians added an anti-tank company to the rifle battalions, which was the first line of defence against German tanks. In 1941, few armies equipped their infantry with effective man-portable anti-tank weapons, but the Russians decided on the anti-tank rifle. Unlike the Germans and other armies, which placed a few in each company, the Russians organised whole anti-tank rifle companies, although they were rather small companies by Western standards. The biggest change was at the regimental level, which lost all its supporting formations except for a few AAMGs. To replace this loss, a mixed mortar battalion was added, equipped with 50mm and 82mm mortars. It's possible when this occurred all the mortars in the rifle battalions were removed, but my sources indicated otherwise. When we move over to the artillery regiment, there was no changes to the previous emergency divisional structure set up in earlier 1941. When we look at the supporting formations, the major change was the addition of a 120mm mortar battalion. This gave the rifle division very much needed additional indirect fire support capability, which the Russian artillery regiment was generally not capable of providing effectively. During the winter of 41-42, the Russians conducted another change. I suspect that removing so much regimental support formations was considered an error, and these were added back again, with some modifications. The 82mm mortars were removed from the rifle battalions to be centralised into mortar battalions. The theory being the limited pool of skilled troops capable of using a weapon like the mortar was concentrated now and was less likely to be casualties in a rear position. The Russians added a rocket artillery battalion to beef up the indirect fire capability, as well as a motorised mortar battalion. The anti-tank battalion was replaced, but the anti-aircraft battalion was replaced with a single company or battery of guns. Let's now drill down into the infantry regiment. At the battalion level, the 82mm mortars were removed. I'm assuming they were consolidated at regimental level. The theory why this occurred was due to a lack of skilled staff to operate the mortars. By concentrating them, the skilled troops capable of using these weapons would be in turn concentrated and would actually gain skills much more rapidly. At the regimental level, the 76mm regimental guns and anti-tank guns returned. I'm uncertain why they were removed in the first place. In addition, an anti-tank rifle company and a SMG company was added. The Russians decided that enough anti-tank rifles had a positive effect, and equipping the rifle regiments lavishly with these weapons was a good idea, but I'm uncertain why an SMG company was added as well. This may have acted as a reserve for the regiment. The existing artillery regiment did not change. However, a rocket artillery battery was added to the division, not in the artillery regiment, under divisional control, which did increase the indirect fire capability of the divisions, especially when attacking. Rocket artillery was not as effective in fire support, but this was something the Russians did rarely, if ever, so it was not a major downside. When we look at the supporting battalions, there were a number of changes. The first being the replacement of the anti-aircraft battalion with a single anti-aircraft battery of 6 37mm anti-aircraft guns. This must have been caused by a lack of weapons rather than the reduction in the effect of the German Luftwaffe. The other change, which does puzzle me, was the addition of a motorised heavy mortar battalion. I'm uncertain how common this was and suspect this was an error in my sources or an ad hoc allocation. The anti-tank battery was returned. I'm thinking the reason why the earlier divisions lost their anti-tank guns was to allow the creation of anti-tank brigades. Regardless, the guns were returning, and it's possible some of the newer 57mm anti-tank guns may have been allocated to the Infantry Division. I doubt it, but it's certainly possible. The Engineer Battalion lost the company. The January 1942 Rifle Division structure did not remain unchanged for long. In March, a new structure was authorised. I should note the dates are all the official authorised dates. In some cases, the changes had already occurred. In others, they were yet to come for the divisions. The motorised heavy mortar battalion is gone, assuming it was ever officially issued. I have my doubts this ever existed in the field. A mixed mortar battalion was added to the division. I personally feel this was added back in January instead of the motorised mortar battalion. So these two changes may not actually be changes. The anti-aircraft battalion returned and the anti-tank battalion started getting some anti-tank rifle troops. When we drill down into the infantry regiments at the battalion level, LMGs were added to the rifle companies, with some additional manpower modifications occurring for the supporting formations. At the regimental support level, some minor manpower modifications occurred, specifically the regimental gun companies. Otherwise, not much changes occurred in this structure. The artillery regiment or the rocket artillery battalion did not change, apart from some manpower modifications, mainly manpower reductions. There was, in theory, a major change. The motorised 120mm armed battalion, that is 120mm mortar battalion, was replaced by a mixed mortar battalion. As I've indicated earlier, I suspect my earlier sources were in error, and this was the structure from January 1942. This gives you an idea of how hard it is to work out what was actually occurring in the field. One change which did occur was a reduction in manpower. The Russians were experiencing manpower shortages and were taking every surplus man they could find to replace losses and form new formations. The first real change was the addition of an anti-tank rifle company to the anti-tank battalion. The final change was the return of the anti-aircraft battalion, with a battery strength increased to 8 guns. 3 months later, we get another major organisational changes to the rifle divisions. It should be pointed out a large number of minor changes would occur every month, possibly related to a battalion or even a company level change. So I'm only covering the major changes, or when the accumulation of changes are large enough to warrant additional information about it. This is another reason why it's hard to keep track of what was occurring. It was really a constant process. While I'm not certain, I suspect a lot of changes only affected new divisions initially, and the old structures would remain in division well after they were officially replaced. The change in July was significant, with the 2nd Artillery Regiment returning, although not with a corresponding major increase in the number of guns. The other change was the addition of an anti-tank battalion and the removal of the mixed mortar battalion. Let's now drill into more detail, starting with the infantry regiments. At the battalion level, the company's strength was reduced. Although the number of automatic weapons was increasing, the battalion gained a mortar company and an SMG company, with the anti-tank rifle company losing some rifles but gaining some 45mm anti-tank guns. At the regimental level, the mixed mortar battalion was replaced with a single 120mm mortar company. My guess is the change was a result of the division going back to a more normal structure. The artillery regiment gained a battalion, but the rocket artillery battalion was now lost. The anti-tank battalion is replaced by a mixed heavy weapon battalion consisting of anti-tank guns, rifles and MMGs. The anti-aircraft battalion is removed and replaced with a company. Once again, I'm uncertain if this represents a real change, but simply an aberration in the previous organisation. In December 1942 or January 1943, the Russians issued a new organisational structure. Most of the changes were reasonably minor. The rifle division was finally beginning to stabilise. When we drill down into the regiments, at the battalion level, company strength continued to reduce, which includes the support formations. The number of MMGs was also reduced, but the number of 82mm mortars was increased. The biggest change was the removal of the 45mm anti-tank guns. When we look at the artillery regiments, there were no changes to the artillery regiment. It consisted of basically 3 battalions of artillery. When we drill down into the supporting battalions, the machine gun battalion lost its 45mm anti-tank guns. I'm uncertain, once again, if these ever really existed and may have been a vestige of the old anti-tank battalion. Otherwise, there were no changes to the supporting battalions. The Russians issued a new organisational change in August 1943. The changes were reasonably minor, in some cases reversed the previous January 1943 changes. While there was certainly a lot of tweaking occurring, the major changes which normally occurred each 3 months were now in the past. We had achieved a new level of stability. Let's drill down into the infantry regiments. At the battalion level, company strength continued to reduce. In this case to 107 men, which is a very small company. The number of LMGs and HMGs went up, so there was a significant increase in automatic weapons. Thus, the firepower remained fairly stable, but the number of men certainly reduces. At the support level, the 45mm anti-tank guns were back. Whenever something like this occurs, which is a reverse of an earlier change, I always wonder if the earlier change ever really happened. In this case, I suspect it did, so represents a correction of a bad idea, or alternatively, there were sufficient 45mm anti-tank guns to start putting them back down into the battalion or regimental level. When we move over to the artillery regiment, there was no changes in terms of equipment, but manpower continued to go down. I can't help but wonder if this had an impact on the effectiveness of the artillery. However, skill levels would now be higher, so that may compensate for a reduction in manpower. In terms of the supporting formations, the machine gun battalion was gone. I suspect its equipment was distributed back into the battalions. The anti-tank battalion did not change, although may be receiving newer equipment. There were 2 versions of the 57mm anti-tank gun, and by August 1943, the ZIS-3 was being issued, although I suspect the newer weapons were reserved for the tank and mech corps, as well as the Guards Rifle Division. I'm not covering the Guards formation in this video. The anti-aircraft company / battery was gone. By August 1943, the Russians were able to meet the Luftwaffe on a more equal level in the air, so I assumed anti-aircraft was allocated from a higher level formation as required. The Russians issued a new change in January 1944, which was primarily focused on new equipment. More ZIS-3 anti-tank guns were finding their way into the anti-tank battalions, for example. In December 1944, the Russians issued a major change. I'm uncertain how many divisions were organised like this, as the burning out of Russian rifle divisions was not as common, so this would have required pulling a functional division out of the front line to reorganise. But I assume by May 1945 there were a number of these divisions in the front line. The biggest change was the addition of a rocket artillery regiment and an anti-aircraft battalion. Let's now look at the attached formations that would have been attached from outside of the divisional structure. I'm uncertain how many attached weapons were ever provided to the infantry divisions. Based on the sources, I have not really seen very much. The only exception may be to attach a heavy mortar battalion to a rifle division for a specific offensive. While this video is not focused on formations below company, the structure of the 1941 Infantry Company is included for completeness. The Russian support company of the infantry battalion was mainly armed with HMGs or MMGs, depending on the mounting, and 8cm mortars or 82mm mortars, but the anti-tank gun formations were also present. This video is mainly based on research which was designed to create army lists, as I indicated at the beginning, for a micro-armour rules, which use the platoon to company as its basic element. As a result, it's not focused on the low-level structure of any formation, which would be the case if it was designed for skirmish or squad scale rules. When using a set of figure gaming rules which uses a scale of one element or base is equal to a platoon or company, it's almost impossible to field historically accurate formations. Most rules designers use an averaging system. A battalion is selected, all the manpower and weapons total, and then divided by the required divisor, perhaps 5 for tanks and guns and 50 for manpower. The result is an accurate battalion, but below that point the elements do not represent any historical formations. If the element or base is a company, the averaging is done at a regimental level. The result of all this averaging is the battalions or regiments are historically accurate, giving a player the required level of national difference to make the game more interesting, and less a chess-like board game. For skirmish or squad level, the focus needs to go down the organisational hierarchy, which is not being attempted here. And so we come to an end, concluding episode 23 of my video series on the Russian Infantry Division. I have no doubt I shall be continuing to update this video in the future as I obtain new source material, with this video being a second version of my original video. I've posted some of the source material I've used in the URL shown in the image. Alle guten Dingen, kommen zu einem Ende.